We're gonna go more into this Anthony Johnson situation. We went over this right here. I showed y'all the slave charts and everything in the last one. For those who didn't check out my last live stream, go check it out. Go check it out. It's almost 2 hours long, but it's 2 hours of straight fire, 2 hours of straight sauce, 2 hours of straight heat, straight up heat for my copper color community. And I want to continue this one right here because it's gonna talk about William Ellison and Anthony Johnson and several other slaves. But let's get into it. Right, we're gonna start right here. In 1644, Thomas Bushrod, a signee of Colonel William Smith, sold a mulatto boy named Manuel as a slave forever, but in September 1644 the said servant was by the assembly adjudged no slave and but to as other Christian servants do, and was freed in September 1665. A similar ruling is found in the case Robinson. In 1649 there were about 300 Africans in the colony, 300 quote-unquote Africans, an increase in mulatto population. African and European indentured servants' offsprings were increasing and considered alarming in regard to the status of the mulatto. That is, a system was evolving based on being either black or white. Africans, and let me just say Aboriginals, because we did the research. We know they was bringing Africans, but it's a small percentage. We know that these copper-colored Aboriginals were black people at one upon a time. They were Negroes, quote-unquote, right? So when we see this term Africans, we just got to keep that in mind. Not trying to say Africans weren't involved, but, you know, most of these Africans were going to South America, not North America. They have boats coming from Europe straight to North America. And the slaves going from South America were being shipped off to North America in exchange for the Aboriginals who lived here on the North American continent. So we have Aboriginals from the South being sent up here in exchange for Aboriginals from the North, because they have a small sufficient supply of African slaves coming from the West African coast. Let's continue. Who entered Jamestown between 1620 and 1650 could expect to be freed after serving their indentured time and given 50 to 250 acres of land, hogs, cows, and seeds, and at the right to import both white and black indentured servants. For a brief period in American history between 1630 and 1670, a number of Africans had become freemen and owned indented white servants. The Act of 1670 forbidden free Negroes to own Christian servants, but conceded the right to own servants of their own race. By 1670, it was becoming customary to hold African servants as slaves for life, and by 1681, what was customary became law. And now we know from the other research too that this included Indians, majority Indians, especially after all of these wars. Moving forward to Anthony Johnson. Black slave owners have not been studied as part of American history, rather as a datum to American history, and yet slavery as a perpetual institution is legalized based on a case brought before the House of Burgess by an African who had been indentured in Jamestown, Virginia, 1621, and was known as Antonio the Negro. What kind of African name is Antonio? Like I said in the last one. According to the earliest records, he later angelicized his name to Anthony. Anthony Johnson was believed to be the first black to set foot on Virginia soil. He was the first black indentured servant, the first free black, and the first to establish the first black community. First black landowner, first black slave owner, and the first person based on his court case to establish slavery legally in North America. One could argue that he was the founder of slavery in Virginia. A black man, founder of slavery in Virginia. Don DeMarco. Anthony Johnson arrived in Jamestown 1621. In 1623, Anthony and Isabella married. they gonna say that this woman Isabella is to believe in as an African too. But again, what kind of name Isabella? Isabella, right? When we do the research on these names and when these names come from, they all have a European background. So in order for these people to be Africans, right, that means the European colonizers had to colonize them first in Africa, then bring them over here. But Africa didn't even get 100% colonized until the 1800s. Until the 1800s. That's when their country got colonized. We got colonized first. 100%. 100%. Right? The next year, they were proud parents of William. William is believed to be the first African American born in British America. During his first years in North America, he escaped death in the Indian attack. By the way, the term African American didn't exist back then. He escaped death in the Indian attack on Jamestown. During the following year, Africans and people of color, who are these people of color and Africans, all copper-colored people, darker-skinned people, were a small minority in the Virginia colony. The census of 1625 reported only 23 Africans living in the colony out of a total of 1,275 white people and indigenous Africans. What? Alright, that whole sentence is bullshit because the census wasn't introduced until 1790. By 1649, the total black population was only 300 out of a total of 18,500 whites. In 1635, Johnson's master, Nathaniel Littleton, finally released him. As the custom, he was received a 250-acre plantation in 1651 under the head right system, by which the colonial government encouraged the population growth by awarding 50 acres of land for every new servant a settler brought to Virginia. He became the master of both black and white servants. Anthony Johnson's plantation was located on the neck of land between two creeks that flowed into the Puntagootee River in Northampton County. I got family coming from Northampton County, and I know that these were the black European slave owners. Emmanuel, his first wife was an indigenous woman, and they had slaves, and it later ended up, interbreeding, into the family, and that blood just carried on for years and years and years. If you guys don't believe me, check out the community section of our YouTube channel, and you would see I posted a picture of what my mom looked like when she was a child, and tell me I'm fucking lying. Excuse my French. Johnson brought 11 servants to the colony and received 550 acres, and Richard brought 2 and received 100 acres. In 1654, Anthony Johnson went to court and sued his white neighbor for keeping his black servant John Casser. We just read that, right? Now we see it's a whole story about this guy, and it continues with multiple different people, and we're going to talk about them. This case establishes perpetual servitude. Oh, we read that too. All right, skipping that. Marie Therese Metoyer. In 1767, a Frenchman named Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer met Marie Therese Coin from the Congo and promptly fell in love. They became immediate occupants in the Natchitoches, Louisiana, where Marie and Claude lived together as man and wife. They had their first children together in January 1768, a set of twins. Things were rough going for the couple. The church would not have anything to do with the relationship, and at this time, Marie and her infant son, Augustine, were still enslaved. Early in 1776, Metoyer purchased his child, and shortly after that, in a private document, he freed Marie and the child. Years later, Marie and Metoyer broke up, but not before fathering 6 children. Marie stayed in Natchitoches and worked for the Melrose Plantation. I don't mean to butcher that name. Claude Metoyer left for her. He then moved to New Orleans, left for France, and married a proper French woman. Considering the fact that all of them were French. They were all French. Not no woman from the Congo. Marie Therese Marie Therese. We got to pay attention to these names. That's what you got to look at. These names. Right? In 1778, free non-whites were a very small minority in Natchitoches, Louisiana. By 1785, that had not changed. Marie Augustine had 2 additional sons born to her after manumissions were half of the free non-white population. By 1786, she had 8 children: Augustine, Pierre, Joseph, Dominique, Francois, Toussaint, Louis, Marie, Suzanne, and 4 of whom were still enslaved. Look at these names, you guys. Pay attention to these names. From the money and land that Meteor gave her, she started a plantation. The first crop was tobacco, and in 1792 she was shipping 9,900 rolls to Cuba for cigars. She also produced indigo, manufactured medicine, and a major source of her income came from hunting bears and fowl. All this was done with the help of her older sons. Because she had no slaves at this time, she tried for 9 years to free her other children from slavery, and in 1815, when Meteor died, all her children were freed. In 1816, written church documents show that she had 12 slaves, but local tradition credits her with many more. Marie Theresa now had 3 plots of land estimated at 11,000 acres. She was now in her late 60s and completely turned over the plantation to her children. She died sometime in the spring of 1816. Augustine was now married and on his own since 1795, Augustine being her son. He was the first of Marie and Claude's children to acquire a plantation and become a slave owner. Within 2 years, he purchased his first slave, a male between the age of 18 and 20, to help him clear the fields. Most of the slaves he brought were for labor, but he did purchase some for family devotion. In 1798, he brought his second slave, an 8-year-old named Marguerite, who was his wife's sister. In 1800, now you see, stop right here. I told you guys, a lot of this stuff was being done to keep the family together, so they won't be brought by other slave owners or slave masters that separated the family. You know, a lot of that stuff was being done for that specific reason. In 1800, $300 was paid for his third slave. This was a child of his still enslaved brother. The next year, a slave named Marie was purchased and became Pierre's wife. His second labor slave was purchased in 1806, a female to be for the wife of the male he already owned. In June of 1809, Augustine purchased 8 African Negroes, quote unquote, for $3,500 cash. A male, 5 boys, 2 girls aged 11 to 13, and then 3 of the males were sold to his brother for $1,350. In 1850, he purchased 2 more slaves from a planter in the next county. Similar purchases and manumissions are recorded for the Meteor children. In 1810, Marie Suzanne purchased a slave costing $600. The peculiar thing was that she was still a slave herself. So slaves was buying slaves and still being slaves? That's new information to me. New information to me. By the 1810 census, Augustine had 17 slaves, Louise 15, P